The truth you are about to hear has been kept hidden for more than 17 centuries. It began in a closed chamber where the fate of faith itself was sealed. There, a group of men, neither prophets nor saints, sat under the flickering light of torches, debating who would be God for all of humanity. They wore robes of authority, not of holiness. They weren't chosen by divine vision, but by imperial order. This was not a moment of revelation, it was a moment of selection. Over 1700 years ago, within the marble walls of Nicaea, the destiny of Christianity was rewritten, not by inspiration from heaven, but by votes from men. Imagine that! God decided by majority rule? They chose which words of Jesus would survive and which would be erased forever. The sacred texts you know today, the Gospels you were told were the only truth, were filtered through political interest and imperial ambition. The rest, the ones that spoke of freedom, of inner divinity, of personal connection to God, were silenced, burned, or buried. Have you ever felt that strange discomfort when listening to sermons, as if something was missing, as if you were only hearing half the story? That instinct was not wrong. Something was missing. Something had been deliberately removed long before you were born. Because in the 4th century, the divine was rewritten into something controllable. The truth that once spoke of liberation was reshaped into obedience. And a faith that once connected souls directly to the source became an empire's greatest instrument of power. It all began when a pagan emperor, Constantine, newly converted to Christianity, not out of spiritual revelation but political necessity, faced a divided empire. The faith of Jesus had spread, yes, but it had splintered into countless interpretations. Different communities preached different truths. To Constantine, this was not a theological crisis. It was a political one. An empire divided in spirit could never be united in law. So, in the year 325 AD, he summoned more than 300 bishops to the city of Nicaea. His goal was simple: to forge one official version of Christianity that could serve both heaven and the empire. Behind closed doors, surrounded by imperial guards, the bishops debated not the mysteries of the divine, but the politics of belief. They argued over which gospel should be called holy and which should vanish from memory. They voted, yes, voted, on which version of Jesus would be remembered: divine, human, or something in between. And in that room, God became law. Those who disagreed were branded heretics. Those who resisted risked exile, or worse. What emerged from that council was a new version of Christianity, one stripped of its most empowering teachings. The Gospels that spoke of personal awakening, of the kingdom within, of the divine spark in every soul, were rejected. Texts that taught self-realization and direct connection to God without priests or temples were declared dangerous. They were not rejected because they were false. They were rejected because they were liberating. Can you feel it, the weight of that choice echoing through history? Because that single council, hidden behind imperial walls, didn't just decide theology. It decided your relationship with God. It created a spiritual hierarchy that would last for millennia, turning divine truth into organized doctrine and free seekers into faithful dependence. For 17 centuries, the world lived under that edited version of Jesus' message, a version designed to create spiritual dependency rather than spiritual empowerment. A version that told you salvation came through men in robes, through rituals, through obedience, not through your own divine essence. But fragments of the forbidden truth survived. Whispered through secret manuscripts, hidden in desert caves, they tell a story far more radical and far more human than the one the empire approved. It is the story of a teacher who said the kingdom of heaven is not in temples or in the sky, but within you. It is the story of a man who reminded people not of their sin, but of their divinity. And it is the story of how that truth was silenced, because a person who knows their inner light cannot be controlled. The church hid the council where they chose who would be God. And now, after 17 centuries, the truth is rising again. The year is 325 AD. The Roman Empire, vast and trembling beneath the weight of its own contradictions, teeters between old gods and a new faith. At its heart stands Emperor Constantine, a man who worshipped the sun for most of his life, a man who claimed to see a cross in the sky before a battle, and a man who would soon reshape the destiny of Christianity forever. History paints him as a saintly ruler chosen by God, but the truth is more complex. Constantine was no theologian. He was a strategist, brilliant, ambitious, and utterly pragmatic. His conversion to Christianity was not born from revelation, but from calculation. He needed a religion that could unify the empire, bind diverse peoples under one divine banner, and stabilize his rule. Christianity, fractured and scattered as it was, offered him exactly that opportunity, if he could bring it under control. At that time, Christianity wasn't a single unified faith. It was a tapestry of beliefs, each thread telling a different story of who Jesus was and what he taught. Some saw him as divine, others as a man enlightened by God. Some believed in the resurrection of the soul within this very life. Others spoke of reincarnation, of multiple lifetimes to refine one's spirit. There were even communities where women led rituals and taught spiritual equality, following gospels that honored Mary Magdalene, not as a repentant sinner, but as a teacher of sacred wisdom. This diversity, though spiritually rich, was politically dangerous. An empire cannot thrive when truth itself is fluid. To rule hearts, the emperor needed a single, absolute doctrine, a version of God that would demand obedience, not questioning. And so, Constantine summoned the bishops of the empire to Nicaea, a city in what is now Turkey. 300 men, each with their own version of the divine, traveled there under imperial command. Some came reluctantly, others saw an opportunity to shape eternity. Imagine the scene. Torches flickering against stone walls, parchment spread across heavy wooden tables, voices rising in heated argument. Outside, imperial guards stood watch, not over heresy, but over dissent. Inside, theology clashed with ambition. Bishops accused one another of blasphemy. Words like truth and heresy flew like weapons. At the center of this storm sat Constantine, unbaptized, unfamiliar with the scriptures, yet presiding over the most important theological decision in human history. He listened, he nodded, and when tempers flared, he reminded them that unity, not truth, was the goal. The issue was monumental. Was Jesus fully God, fully man, or both? One faction, led by Arius, argued that Jesus was divine but not equal to the Father, that he was created, a being of light but not the source of it. Another faction, led by Athanasius, claimed the opposite, that Jesus was of the same substance as God himself, equal in every way. This was not just a theological debate, it was the very foundation of authority. If Jesus was equal to God, then the church could claim absolute power in his name. If he was a man enlightened by the divine, then anyone, any soul, could walk the same path. The difference between those two ideas was the difference between freedom and control. Constantine understood this well. A faith that empowered individuals would fragment his empire. A faith that demanded obedience would unite it. And so, he subtly guided the council's outcome, not through revelation, but through political pressure. Those who resisted the emperor's will faced exile. Those who complied were rewarded with titles and favor. When the vote was finally cast, the decision came by a narrow margin. Jesus was declared of the same substance as the Father. The doctrine of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, was born not from divine vision, but from political convenience. The council also produced something else, the Nicene Creed, a declaration every Christian would be required to recite to prove their loyalty. Refuse, and you were a heretic. Resist, and you risked exile, or worse. It was at that moment that faith became law, and questioning became rebellion. The emperor had succeeded. Christianity was no longer a spiritual movement, it was an imperial instrument. But what of the other Gospels, the ones that didn't fit this new version of truth? They were condemned, labeled heretical, and ordered to be destroyed. Texts that spoke of reincarnation vanished. Gospels written by women disappeared. Teachings that encouraged direct union with the divine were silenced. The world would soon forget that such writings ever existed. But a few monks, scribes, and seekers refused to let the light die. They hid scrolls in caves, buried codices in the sands of Egypt, and prayed that one day the truth would be rediscovered. Their prayers would be answered centuries later. But for now, as the bishops left Nicaea under the emperor's approving gaze, Christianity had been reborn, not as the voice of Christ, but as the instrument of Caesar. And thus began the long night of spiritual amnesia, a silence that would last for 1,700 years. Picture this, a vast hall in Nicaea, thick with the scent of burning oil and tension. Rows of bishops whisper behind their robes, parchment scrolls in their trembling hands. At the far end of the chamber sits Emperor Constantine, silent, his eyes cold and calculating beneath the golden wreath of Rome. Outside, the wind from the Anatolian hills rattles the shutters, but inside, the air is suffocating. The fate of God himself is about to be decided. They called it a council of faith, but it looked more like a trial of truth. No one there had seen Jesus, none had heard his voice. Yet in that moment, these men claimed the right to define him, to decide whether he was man, divine, or something in between. The debate was fierce, relentless. Words clashed like swords. On one side stood Arius, a priest from Alexandria, calm but defiant. He argued that Jesus was begotten of the Father, not equal, but created. The Son, he said, cannot be the same as the one who made him. To Arius, Jesus was divine, yes, but not God himself. Across from him stood Athanasius, fierce and unyielding, declaring that Christ was of the same substance as the Father, homoousios, and therefore eternal, equal, absolute. Anything less, he insisted, would shatter the foundation of salvation. Each argument was loaded not only with theology, but with consequence. If Arius was right, every believer could aspire to the same divine connection as Jesus, a vision of spiritual equality. If Athanasius prevailed, Jesus would stand alone, a being so divine, so unique, that humanity could never reach his level. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between awakening and obedience, between spiritual sovereignty and submission. Constantine listened, his expression unreadable. To him, both sides spoke of mysteries that mattered little to his throne. What mattered was unity. He needed one doctrine, one church, one truth, something that could be controlled, recited, and enforced. And so, when the debate reached a deadlock, he intervened, not as a theologian, but as an emperor. Those who resisted his vision were warned, defy the creed, and you defy the empire. When the final vote was called, the room fell into a heavy silence. Bishops exchanged nervous glances, their faith weighed against fear. Then, one by one, hands rose, hesitant, trembling, coerced. The decision passed by a narrow margin. Jesus was officially declared of the same substance as the Father. The mystery of God was settled by majority vote. Imagine that. The infinite, the eternal, the sacred, decided like a political election. Some bishops wept. Others sat in silence, knowing history had just been rewritten. A few, unable to betray their conscience, refused to sign the creed. They were branded heretics, stripped of their positions, and sent into exile. Arius himself would be banished, his followers hunted down, his writings ordered to be burned. But burning words cannot destroy truth. It only buries it. In the years that followed, Constantine would distribute the new Nicene Creed across his empire. Every church was required to proclaim it aloud, every believer to recite it as proof of loyalty. The message was clear. Faith was no longer a personal revelation, it was an imperial command. The transformation was complete. What began as a movement of free souls seeking inner divinity had become a state religion, bound by decree and ruled by hierarchy. And yet, beneath the ashes of this new orthodoxy, the embers of the forbidden teachings still glowed. Whispers persisted of gospels that had not been approved. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip. They spoke of a Jesus who taught self-knowledge over obedience, who said, "The kingdom of God is within you and all around you." Those words were too dangerous to survive the empire's new order. For if every person discovered the divine within, who would kneel to the emperor? Who would fear the priest? And so, for 17 centuries, the world would live under the shadow of that vote, a moment when men turned mystery into dogma and revelation into rule. But the truth never truly died. It slept, hidden beneath sand and time, waiting for the day humanity would be ready to remember. That day is now. The Council of Nicaea ended with a proclamation that would echo for millennia. The bishops returned to their cities carrying the new creed like a royal decree, their scrolls stamped with imperial approval. Constantine had achieved what no emperor before him dared. He had turned faith into law, and law into faith. But beneath the triumphal chants of unity, another sound began to rise, the quiet rustle of pages being hidden, sealed, or burned. The forbidden Gospels were vanishing. There were once dozens of them, texts written by the early followers of Jesus, long before the church chose which stories would define him. These Gospels were not uniform. They were as diverse and luminous as the communities that guarded them. The Gospel of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, Philip, Judas, and many more. Each offered a glimpse into a Jesus that the empire could not control. Some described him as a teacher of consciousness, revealing that the kingdom of heaven was not a place beyond death, but a state of awakening within. Others recorded his teachings to women, conversations about divine equality, spiritual authority, and the balance between masculine and feminine energy in creation. These texts were dangerous not because they were false, but because they were empowering. They spoke of a God who lived inside you, not one confined to temples, altars, or priestly authority. They described resurrection as a transformation of the soul, not a promise of reward after obedience. They told of Jesus saying, "When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father." That one sentence alone could undo the entire machinery of institutional power. If the kingdom was within, who needed the empire? If each soul was divine, who needed an intermediary? If you could find God in silence, what need was there for ceremony? Constantine's newly unified church saw the danger immediately. A faith built on spiritual independence could not be ruled. And so the order was given. Destroy what divides, preserve what unites. meaning eliminate all that empowered the individual. Across the empire, libraries of sacred writings were burned. In Alexandria, scrolls vanished into flame. In Antioch, monks were imprisoned for refusing to surrender their manuscripts. In Egypt, entire monasteries sealed their hidden treasures within clay jars and buried them in the desert, praying that the truth would one day be rediscovered. And it was, 1,600 years later, in a place called Nag Hammadi. In 1945, two farmers digging for fertilizer near the Nile unearthed a jar containing 13 leather-bound codices, texts lost since the age of Constantine. When scholars began to translate them, history trembled. Inside were the Gnostic Gospels, forbidden texts that spoke of Jesus not as a distant deity, but as a mirror showing humanity its own divine reflection. These writings revealed a Christianity that was mystical, experiential, intimate. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds will precede you. If they say it is in the sea, the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is within you, and it is outside you." Those words shattered centuries of doctrine. The kingdom is not somewhere you go, it is something you awaken to. But to the early empire, such an idea was heresy. It gave too much power to the individual. It threatened not only theology, but control. Because if you could reach God through your own soul, the emperor's priests became unnecessary. And so, for 17 centuries, humanity prayed to the heavens, searching for a God that had never left them. Churches rose, wars were fought, heretics burned. All the while, the simplest truth of all lay buried beneath the desert sands. You were never separate from the divine. The forbidden Gospels reveal a portrait of Jesus that no empire could allow. A teacher of awakening, not obedience. A man who reminded humanity of its forgotten nature, not its sin. A voice whispering, "You are the temple. You are the light. You are already whole." But what frightened the church most wasn't the words themselves, it was what they implied. That salvation could not be sold. That holiness could not be owned. That God could not be controlled. And so they buried the books. They silenced the voices. They rewrote the story. But truth, like light, cannot be destroyed. It only waits. For centuries, that light slept in the dust, until the world was ready to see again. And when the scrolls of Nag Hammadi were finally unsealed, humanity glimpsed the first crack in the wall of its spiritual captivity. The teachings that once empowered the first followers of Jesus began to whisper again across the world, calling people to remember what they always were. Now, as more eyes open and more souls awaken, that whisper grows louder. The kingdom is within you. The ink of the Nicene Creed had barely dried when Emperor Constantine realized the magnitude of what he had achieved. In one calculated act, he had not only unified the fractured faith of an empire, but forged a new kind of power, a divine empire ruled through belief. He had done what no army could, conquered hearts in the name of heaven. Before Nicaea, Rome ruled by the sword. After Nicaea, it ruled by the cross. From that day forward, Christianity was no longer a movement of humble seekers, wandering preachers, or desert mystics. It became the empire's official religion, a system of power, hierarchy, and control. The church was no longer the voice of Christ. It became the echo of Caesar. Constantine built majestic cathedrals on the ruins of pagan temples, not out of devotion, but symbolism. The message was clear. The gods of old had fallen, and Rome now stood as the throne of the one true God. But behind the marble and gold, the emperor's motives were pragmatic. He needed an empire that worshipped one God, because one God meant one authority. If people believed there was only a single divine truth, they would obey the single man who claimed to guard it. Thus, the union of altar and throne was born. Constantine didn't just unify religion, he weaponized it. The same empire that once persecuted Christians now wielded Christianity as its new banner of conquest. Soldiers marched with crosses on their shields, and priests blessed their swords. The words of Jesus, who had once preached love and humility, were now twisted into tools of imperial loyalty. The transformation was astonishing. Within a generation, the underground gatherings of believers who had met in secret to share bread and stories of the living Christ were replaced by monumental basilicas filled with gold, incense, and imperial decrees. Bishops began dressing like governors, and sermons echoed the voice of Rome more than the whispers of the Spirit. The message of spiritual liberation was slowly rewritten into a doctrine of obedience. Instead of "the kingdom is within you," believers were told "the kingdom is in the church." Instead of "you are children of the living Father," they were told "you are sinners in need of salvation." Instead of finding God through experience, they were told to seek Him through intermediaries. And yet, something deep within the human spirit resisted. Many early followers still remembered the older teachings, the ones that spoke of inner light, divine equality, and the direct connection between the soul and God. To silence them, Constantine's new church issued decrees condemning all false gospels. The forbidden texts were burned. The teachers who quoted them were exiled, imprisoned, or executed. In one chilling edict, Constantine ordered that anyone caught copying or reading heretical writings should have their manuscripts confiscated and destroyed by fire, so that no trace may remain. But truth always leaves traces. In the deserts of Egypt and Syria, small groups of seekers, known later as Gnostics, continued to practice the original inner teachings of Christ. They meditated, fasted, and sought visions of divine light. They saw Jesus not as a distant deity, but as a mirror reflecting their own potential. They believed salvation was not something given, but something remembered. These were the spiritual rebels, the last guardians of a faith that couldn't be owned. As the empire grew in wealth and prestige, the message of Jesus grew narrower, safer, and easier to control. The concept of divine authority was replaced by institutional hierarchy. Bishops became princes, popes became kings. And slowly, Rome crowned itself not only as the capital of the world, but as the gatekeeper of heaven. Constantine himself, though hailed as a Christian emperor, delayed his own baptism until his deathbed. He had built the machinery of faith, but he never fully entered it. Perhaps he knew that the religion he had created was not the one Jesus had taught. Under his reign, Christianity ceased to be a path of transformation and became a system of control, a way to sanctify the empire's power and to bind people's souls with invisible chains of doctrine. It was no longer about awakening the divine spark within, but about obeying the voice of authority without. And yet, the irony remains. The same empire that sought to suppress the truth ended up spreading it. As Roman soldiers carried the cross to distant lands, fragments of the original teachings traveled with them. Whispers of the kingdom within passed quietly from soul to soul, surviving through the centuries like hidden embers waiting to reignite. 17 centuries later, those embers are glowing again. The rediscovered manuscripts, the Gospels buried beneath time and fear, have returned to remind humanity of what was stolen, that God was never outside you. And as these ancient words resurface, the empire that tried to silence them begins to crumble, not in stone, but in spirit. Because no power can rule forever over a truth that was born to set you free. Imagine standing in a dimly lit cave in Egypt, brushing the dust from a parchment sealed for over 1,000 years. The ink is faded, the language ancient, but the words that emerge feel alive, as if they had been waiting for this very moment to speak again. The kingdom is within you, and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that you are children of the living Father. This is not a line from the Bible you grew up with. It's from the Gospel of Thomas, one of the many sacred writings banished by the early church, declared heresy, hidden, and nearly forgotten. And yet, here it is. Jesus speaking not as a distant savior, but as a teacher of divine awakening. These lost teachings present a picture of Christ that is breathtakingly intimate. He is not a God demanding worship, but a mirror showing humanity its own reflection. He does not come to save you from sin. He comes to remind you that you were never separated from God in the first place. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Jesus entrusts his deepest wisdom not to Peter or John, but to Mary. He speaks to her about the ascent of the soul, how the human spirit, burdened by fear and ignorance, can rise through layers of consciousness to reunite with the divine. When she shares this vision with the others, Peter grows angry. Did he really speak privately to a woman and not openly to us? Did he prefer her to us? Mary answers calmly, "My brother Peter, do you think that I thought this up by myself, or that I am lying about the Savior?" That single exchange reveals a spiritual truth too radical for its time, that divine wisdom is not bound by gender, authority, or hierarchy. In those few lines, the Gospel of Mary threatens the entire patriarchal structure of the church that would soon rise to power. Then there is the Gospel of Philip, a text so rich in mystical insight that it reads more like poetry than doctrine. In it, Jesus teaches that true resurrection is not a future miracle. It is a state of consciousness available here and now. Those who say they will first die and then be resurrected are mistaken. If they do not first receive the resurrection while they are alive, when they die, they will receive nothing. It is a staggering statement. The resurrection, he says, is not about escaping the world. It's about awakening within it. It is the moment when the veil of separation between the human and the divine falls away, and you remember that you have always been part of God. Other fragments, like the Gospel of Truth, speak of the world as a place of forgetfulness, a dream in which humanity wanders, seeking the Father who has never left them. Ignorance of the Father brought about anguish, it says. But when the Father is known, that ignorance dissolves. These teachings turn traditional theology inside out. They say that sin is not a moral failure, but a forgetting of who you are. That salvation is not granted by a priest, but recovered through remembrance. That the divine is not confined to heaven, but woven through your very being. No wonder the church feared them. A faith built on personal awakening would have no need for mediators, rituals, or institutions. A person who realized they were divine by nature couldn't be ruled through guilt or fear. The hierarchy would crumble the moment people remembered they were already free. And so these writings were condemned, declared dangerous, buried. But they survived, in hidden monasteries, sealed caves, and the hearts of those who refused to forget. The Gnostic communities, those early mystics of the desert, continued to teach these truths in secret. They believed that Jesus' true mission was not to found a religion, but to ignite remembrance, to awaken the divine spark sleeping within every human soul. For centuries, the world lived without these words, and Christianity became a faith of submission rather than transformation. The teachings of direct union with the divine were replaced with commandments, creeds, and confession. The temple of the heart was replaced by temples of stone. But when those lost gospels resurfaced in the 20th century, the effect was seismic. Scholars were astonished. Believers were shaken. Suddenly, the familiar image of Jesus, the distant, unreachable Savior, was replaced by something far more profound. A teacher of consciousness who saw no separation between himself and those he taught. He said, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift a stone, and you will find me." In those words lies the essence of the forgotten truth. The divine is everywhere. It is in your breath, in the wind, in the eyes of the stranger who smiles at you. It is not bound by creed, language, or ritual. It does not demand submission. It invites awareness. That is what they tried to erase. That is the truth the empire feared, that the same light that shone in Jesus also shines in you. For if humanity ever fully remembered that truth, no throne could hold power, no empire could control faith, and no institution could stand between the soul and God. And now, after 17 centuries of silence, that truth is rising again. Alive, undeniable, unstoppable. The word heresy once meant something noble. In Greek, hieresis simply meant choice. To be a heretic was to choose, to seek one's own understanding of truth, to think with the freedom that God Himself had given to the human mind. But after the Council of Nicaea, that word was twisted into a weapon. Choice became rebellion, questioning became sin, and truth, once the path to God, became a crime against the Church. The new empire of faith needed order, not revelation. Unity, not diversity. A single truth protected by authority, enforced by fear. And so, those who held to the older, more mystical forms of Christianity, the ones who still believed in the divine spark within, became enemies of orthodoxy. They called themselves Gnostics, from gnosis, meaning knowledge. But the Church called them heretics. Their teachings were too dangerous, not because they denied Christ, but because they understood Him too well. They believed that salvation came not from obedience, but from awakening, through direct experience of the divine. They said that Jesus had come not to found an institution, but to remind humanity of its forgotten power. To the bishops of Rome and Constantinople, this was intolerable. A person who believed that God lived within needed no priest. A person who trusted their inner voice could not be ruled by dogma. So the campaign began, not of conversion, but of elimination. The bishops issued decrees condemning the Gnostics. Their writings were burned, their gatherings outlawed. In some cities, entire communities disappeared overnight. Monks who refused to surrender their scrolls were executed as blasphemers. Those who fled took their sacred texts into the desert, hiding them in caves. Scrolls like those later found in Nag Hammadi, sealed away in silence for over 1,000 years. In time, the Church built its own machinery of control. It created councils to define truth and courts to punish deviation. It replaced dialogue with doctrine, revelation with recitation. By the 6th century, the Church had not only redefined heresy, it had institutionalized it. To think differently was to risk your life. And so, what had once been a movement of spiritual freedom turned into a hierarchy of fear. The flame of gnosis, that inner knowing, was nearly extinguished. But it survived, carried quietly through the centuries by mystics, poets, and visionaries. It flickered in the writings of the Desert Fathers, who spoke of finding God in silence. It glowed in the secret symbols of the Cathars and the teachings of Meister Eckhart, who said, "The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me." Each time this light reappeared, the institution struck it down. The Cathars were exterminated, the Templars burned, the mystics censured. The Inquisition was born, not as a defense of faith, but as a war against memory. Every stake that blazed, every book that turned to ash was a message. Do not think for yourself. Do not remember who you are. But something in the human spirit cannot be silenced. For even as the Church defined heresy, it could not define the soul. The divine whisper that Jesus once awakened continued to echo through history, disguised in art, in music, in the quiet prayers of those who sought God not in cathedrals, but in the stillness of their own hearts. Centuries later, when the forbidden manuscripts finally resurfaced, scholars began to see the pattern. The same idea appearing again and again in every age, under every persecution. The idea that God lives within you, that you do not need permission to experience the sacred, that divinity is your birthright. And so the word heretic began to change once more. It returned to its original meaning, not rebellion against God, but rebellion against lies. The true heretics were never those who sought the divine. They were those who refused to surrender their souls to empire. For what greater faith could there be than to trust that the voice of God speaks directly within you, beyond priests, beyond councils, beyond fear? That was the faith of the first followers of Jesus. That was the truth that survived fire and persecution. And that is the truth awakening again today. The church once tried to erase it by branding it heresy. But all they really did was rename the path of spiritual freedom. Because to choose truth over obedience, to seek God within instead of beyond, that is and always will be the most sacred act of all. For nearly 17 centuries, the forbidden words of Jesus slept beneath the sands of time, buried, forgotten, and cursed. The empire that silenced them had long crumbled into dust, but its shadow remained. People still prayed to the edited God it had created, still recited the creeds born of politics, still searched for heaven beyond while ignoring the light within. And then, one day, the earth itself gave up the secret it had been keeping. It was December 1945, in the Egyptian desert near a village called Nag Hammadi. Two farmers, searching for fertile soil, struck something solid in the ground, a large sealed clay jar. At first, they thought it might contain gold. When they broke it open, they found not treasure, but 13 leather-bound books written in a language no one alive could read. Unknowingly, they had unearthed one of the greatest discoveries in human spiritual history, the Gnostic Gospels, the very texts that had been declared heretical and ordered destroyed by the early church nearly 2,000 years earlier. Inside those fragile pages was the voice of a forgotten Christianity, a Jesus who taught of consciousness, inner divinity, and liberation through self-knowledge. Words that had been silenced by flame now spoke again through sand and time. When scholars began translating them, they could hardly believe what they saw. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Truth, and others, each one revealing a Jesus more human, more intimate, more revolutionary than the one history had allowed. In these texts, Jesus didn't speak of sin and punishment, he spoke of awakening. He didn't threaten hell, he revealed heaven as a living reality within the human soul. He said, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring it forth, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. That sentence alone turns the entire machinery of institutional religion upside down. Salvation, he said, is not something given by priests, it's something remembered by the soul. The discovery shook the foundations of biblical scholarship. Suddenly, the idea that early Christianity was unified fell apart. Scholars realized that in the first centuries after Jesus, there wasn't one Christianity, there were many. Dozens of communities, each preserving their own vision of the divine, their own memory of the Christ. And among them, the Gnostics stood apart. They didn't build temples, they didn't demand creeds. They practiced meditation, contemplation, and the pursuit of direct knowledge, gnosis. Their rituals were symbolic, their prayers inward, their goal not worship, but realization. The church had called them heretics. History had erased their names. But in the pages of those long-buried codices, their voices spoke once more. The more the scholars translated them, the more they realized how deep the manipulation had gone. Many of these texts predated the canonical Gospels, or were based on older oral traditions, meaning they could be closer to Jesus' actual words than the edited versions chosen at Nicaea. And yet, for centuries, these teachings had been called lies. The truth was this: what the church had feared most was not contradiction. It was empowerment. Because a humanity that knew it was divine could not be ruled. A soul that recognized its own light could not be chained by fear. These rediscovered gospels changed everything. They revealed that Christianity's original message was not one of guilt and subservience, but one of remembrance and unity. That the goal of life was not to beg for salvation, but to awaken to the divine already within you. Across the world, as news of the Nag Hammadi discovery spread, a quiet revolution began. Philosophers, theologians, and spiritual seekers started to re-examine the roots of faith. Some saw in these texts a bridge between East and West, between mysticism and science, between ancient wisdom and modern consciousness. Others felt fear, because the line between God and man was dissolving. For the first time in 17 centuries, humanity was hearing the voice of Jesus unfiltered, unedited, unowned. And that voice didn't command obedience. It whispered remembrance. It said, "The light within you is the same light that fills the heavens. When you know this, you will no longer live in darkness." That is why these manuscripts had to be buried, because they carried the seed of liberation. And that is why they could never truly die, because truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced forever. Now, as those ancient words are read again by millions, something extraordinary is happening. People are awakening, remembering, reconnecting. The same truth that ignited the souls of the first followers of Jesus is awakening in hearts across the world. What the church once called heresy is being recognized for what it always was: the hidden half of the gospel, the missing piece of humanity's spiritual memory. The sands of Egypt had preserved not just old texts, but an ancient invitation to stop searching for God outside and begin discovering Him within. And once you accept that invitation, there is no going back. Because when you awaken to the truth buried in those pages, you realize that it was never the Gospels that were lost. It was us. The discovery of the lost Gospels revealed more than hidden texts. It exposed an ancient wound. A wound inflicted not on parchment, but on the human soul. For centuries, humanity had been taught to look upward for what was always within. The church had replaced remembrance with repentance, awakening with obedience, and fear with fear. When Constantine's version of Christianity spread across the empire, it carried with it a new theology, one built not on inner discovery, but on dependence. To maintain control, the rulers of faith needed something stronger than faith itself. They needed fear. Fear became the invisible throne on which the church would sit for over 1,000 years. Fear of sin, fear of damnation, fear of God Himself. People were told that they were born stained, broken, and unworthy, that only the church could cleanse them, that only through sacraments, confession, and obedience could they escape the eternal fire. The same Jesus who once said, "The kingdom is within you," was now portrayed as a distant judge holding the keys to heaven and hell. This was no accident. It was design. The church had discovered what empires before it had always known. Nothing controls the human heart more completely than guilt. Guilt makes you obedient. Fear makes you dependent. And so salvation became a transaction. Heaven a reward for loyalty. Hell a punishment for doubt. Every ritual, every confession, every tithe became part of a spiritual economy, built on keeping humanity in a constant state of self-condemnation. But beneath the weight of that fear, the human soul never stopped whispering. Across centuries of sermons and smoke, mystics still heard another voice, a gentler one. They heard it in silence, in solitude, in moments when guilt could no longer drown out grace. It was the same voice that spoke to Moses in the desert, to Elijah in the wind, to Jesus in the wilderness. It said, "You were never apart from me." The Church, fearing the return of that inner voice, worked to monopolize access to the divine. It declared that revelation had ended, that no one could hear God except through its authority. It claimed the right to interpret Scripture, to define truth, to decide who could be saved and who must be condemned. And so, the walls of the sacred became prisons of the spirit. The empire of faith turned inward, feeding on fear. It persecuted those who spoke of light within. It silenced those who sought direct communion with God. Mystics who described divine union were branded as blasphemers. Women who experienced visions were accused of witchcraft. Entire movements of spiritual seekers, the Cathars, the Bogomils, the Albigensians, were erased from history. Their teachings burned along with their bodies. It was not enough to control belief. The Church sought to control imagination itself. Every painting of judgment, every sermon of fire, every symbol of the serpent and the cross was designed to remind humanity, you are guilty, you are small, you are powerless. And yet, paradoxically, within that guilt was hidden a truth so radiant that no doctrine could completely extinguish it. Because fear cannot destroy what it depends upon. The Church could only manipulate the idea of God because the spark of God was already alive in the people it ruled. And every so often, that spark flared. In a monk's silent prayer, in a mystic's forbidden poem, in a child's innocent laughter that felt like grace. The divine kept leaking through the cracks of control. And through time, those cracks widened. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of reason and individual conscience, all were, in their own ways, echoes of the same truth reawakening, that divinity belongs to no institution. Even now, the echo continues. People are remembering that God was never a judge waiting above, but a presence dwelling within. They are beginning to see that salvation was never something to earn, but something to realize. Imagine how different the world might have been if instead of fear, humanity had been taught love. If instead of guilt, we had been shown grace. If instead of submission, we had been encouraged to awaken. We might have built not cathedrals of power, but communities of wisdom. We might have known heaven not as a promise after death, but a presence available now. But it is not too late, because fear, no matter how deeply rooted, cannot outlive truth. The lost Gospels have returned, and with them a forgotten vision of humanity's spiritual potential. A vision where the divine and the human are not enemies, but reflections of one another. That is what the empire of fear tried to erase. And that is what is returning now, unstoppable, radiant, inevitable. The same truth that shook the Council of Nicaea is rising again, not in temples, but in hearts. Not in dogmas, but in awareness. Because when the soul remembers who it is, no empire of fear can stand against it. 17 centuries have passed since a handful of men gathered in Nicaea and decided who God would be. 17 centuries of silence, obedience, and longing. 17 centuries of prayers sent upward, never realizing that the answer had always been within. But something is changing. You can feel it, can't you? Across the world, hearts are stirring. People are questioning the stories they were told about guilt and salvation, about heaven and hell, about a God who hides behind walls and speaks only through chosen men. That quiet restlessness inside you, that subtle sense that there must be more, is not rebellion. It is remembrance. For the first time since the dawn of empire, humanity is remembering what was stolen from it, the truth of its own divinity. The rediscovered Gospels, once buried in sand, now travel across digital networks and human consciousness alike. Their words echo again, ancient, familiar, alive. The kingdom is within you. You are children of the living Father. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. These are not metaphors. They are instructions, keys to awakening. Because when you turn inward, when you quiet the noise of dogma and doctrine, something remarkable happens. The voice that once seemed lost begins to speak again, not from heaven above, but from the stillness inside. It says, "You were never separated. You were never condemned. You were never less than divine." That voice is the same one that spoke to the prophets, to the mystics, to Jesus himself. It is the eternal current of consciousness flowing through all things, waiting for you to notice it. This is the awakening that the empire feared. This is the remembering that can unmake centuries of control. Because once you know that God dwells within you, you no longer need permission to feel holy. Once you see that heaven is a state of being, you no longer wait for death to be free. Once you understand that you and the divine are not two, but one, the entire architecture of fear collapses. You realize that you were never a sinner begging for mercy. You were a seeker longing for memory. That the so-called fall was never a punishment. It was a forgetting. And that salvation is not earned through suffering. It is found through awareness. This is the revolution of consciousness that is now unfolding across the planet. It is not led by priests or prophets. It doesn't belong to any church, nation, or ideology. It is rising quietly, through meditation, through compassion, through the simple act of turning inward and listening. Every time someone chooses truth over fear, love over control, awareness over obedience, the hidden kingdom grows stronger. Every time someone remembers that they are already divine, the centuries of silence lose their power. The great paradox is this: the same system that once buried the truth has, unknowingly, helped preserve it. For without the long darkness, humanity could not have understood the value of light. Without forgetting, awakening would have no meaning. And without being lost, we could never truly understand what it means to be found. The Council of Nicaea, the Empire of Constantine, the centuries of suppression, all of it, in the end, could only delay what was inevitable: the return of remembrance. Now the truth is rising again, not in the ruins of empires, but in the quiet revolution of the soul. It rises in you. You are the living gospel they tried to erase. You are the scripture written not on parchment, but in light. You are the temple that cannot be destroyed, because it was never built by hands. And when you remember that, the old world begins to crumble, not in violence, but in awakening. The empires built on fear dissolve before the one truth that cannot be silenced. You and the divine are one. So close your eyes. Breathe. Listen. That faint whisper you hear is older than every creed, older than every throne, older than time itself. It says, "You are light. You are love. You are eternal." And that, perhaps, is the truth they feared most. Because a soul that remembers its divinity cannot be ruled, only awakened.